And we are back. Last but not least, entity framework.
Hopefully
data.
not least. Yeah.
So no, absolutely not least, because none of it, you can't do anything with that data.
That's true.
See?
Yep.
So you're really first.
Yep, absolutely.
We're here with Rowan Miller, and we're here on the Microsoft Virtual Academy. We're going to get the scoop on what's going on with Entity Framework 7.
Absolutely.
So who are you?
So I'm Rowan Miller. I work on the Entity Framework team here at Microsoft. I'm a program manager, which means I fill in the gaps for anything that needs doing, as most people who are here today. Focused mainly on Entity Framework, but have a bit to do with everything around the shop. You know, we all work as part of the ASP.NET team as well here. Prior to Microsoft, I worked doing application integration in the enterprise before coming here. And if you want to catch me I blog often at rowmiller.com.
Yeah. All right. Cool. And that's still me.
Yep, nothing's changed.
Nothing's
I
changed.
assume
I'm
since
still
an
the
hour
guy
ago.
who's got his own slide for no reason at all.
Very good.
All right. Cool. So EF.
Yeah.
EF7.
So kind of got three sections to the talk today. We're going to do a few slides just to talk about what EF7 is all about. Then we're going to do one set of demos, which just looks at basic data access using Entity Framework 7. It's kind of the don't freak out, the world hasn't changed demo. And then after that, we'll dig in and have some demos of new features and cool stuff you can do with EF7.
Okay.
Sound good?
Cool.
So EF7, kind of the tagline we use for it is new platforms and new data stores, which sounds great, but I'll spend a little bit of time in a couple of slides talking about what that actually means. So in terms of new platforms, EF has always worked when you target the full .NET framework, WPF, WinForms, ASP.NET vCurrent, etc. Starting in EF7, we're going to be targeting Windows Phone and Windows Store. So this is primarily about local data access. Obviously, on devices, SQLite is the go-to database there. So that would kind of be our default story on Phone and Store. But the full provider model's there. So if we want to target something else on Phone and Store, that would be possible too. In addition, obviously, ASP.NET 5, which is why I'm here today. That includes full .NET Framework and targeting the new core CLR. And then, of course, as we're going cross-platform, we're also going to be able to use EF in your Mac and Linux applications as well.
And presumably to talk to both SQLite and SQL Server proper?
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously on Mac and Linux, kind of the default environment is looking at something like PostgreSQL, so we'll be looking at providers for that as well. So I should mention, this is the core of Entity Framework, supports all these different platforms, but what specific providers are available will depend on what APIs are available on those platforms. Obviously, a lot of providers have some native dependencies, for example, SQL Server, so that may not be available on all platforms. But the core of EF and everything that's kind of baked in will work across this full set of platforms. So then the other half of the equation is new data stores. So historically, EF was all about targeting relational databases, but in EF7, we're opening that up to work with non-relational databases as well. Now, when most people hear this, they kind of freak out and think, oh no, another high-level framework that works great in demos, but falls apart as soon as I try and do anything.
That is kind of what they think.
Yeah, so EF7, we're definitely not building some kind of magical abstraction. The goal is not that you can write some code and have it run on a key value store and a relational database and a document database. The idea is we take the services that make sense on almost all databases, like the unit of work pattern, link queries, change tracking, mapping to POCO types, that kind of stuff. That's kind of baked into the core of EF. And then as you target a specific database, we'll pull in extra extensions that give you the additional capabilities of that. So for example, targeting a relational database, I get the ability to set up cascade delete and things like that. If I target Azure Table Storage, I can set up my row and partition key for the model. And obviously, if I target a relational database, I get additional transaction APIs for working with DB transaction, things like that. Some examples of providers we're working on, obviously SQL Server, that's our bread and butter relational data store. I mentioned SQLite because that's really important for phone, store, device. Azure Table Storage and Redis were just some proof of concept ones we did. And then we're also working on an in-memory database, which is useful when you want a unit test. I should also add to the list, we've done a little bit of work with other people outside of our team on providers for DocumentDB and also for MongoDB as well. So we're kind of exploring, playing around with a whole bunch of different ideas. Now, not all of these are going to ship at our initial release. This is the list that our team is working on, but we've kind of at this stage put Azure Table Storage and Redis to one side while we focus on shoring up SQL Server as our top priority. So you don't expect all this stuff to be RTM quality at the same time. Okay, so that's where we're headed with EF7. Let's talk about how we're going to achieve it. So EF7 is a lightweight and extensible version of EF. We'll dig into what this means. This is somewhat akin, I think the ASP.NET lightweight and extensible aren't the words we use, but we use modular.
Well, does it imply that EF6 is not lightweight or extensible?
Yes, I think it does. Bits of EF6 are extensible. So if you look at things like command interception, which was something we introduced in EF6, we have a common extensible component that we go through whenever we talk to the database. But 98% of the EF code base was written a long time ago, it wasn't factored well, and it doesn't lend itself to being extensible. But also doesn't really lend itself to being lightweight. You get all of EF in memory at the same time.
So it seems like EF7 is to 6 as ASP.NET 5 is to 4. Like you've broken it all apart, make it as lean and mean as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
And
so
modular.
the title I had for this next slide is EF7 is part V7 because, as we're going to see in a minute, it very much is a continuation of Entity Framework, but it's also part V1 because in some cases we're kind of doing away with some of the baggage from our past releases and building things the way we would like them to be built
I
as we
see.
started now.
So like ASP.NET 5, it's an appropriate reboot with concept compatibility, but also in some places all new stuff.
Yeah, and that I think concept compatible is very important. I mean, it sounds like a cheesy marketing line, but it's something we care passionately about.
As long as it's true,
yeah, and
then it's not a cheesy marketing line.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, EF6.x codebase, we just had a lot of baggage in there. It wasn't well factored, so we had to look at a bit of a reboot. And as you mentioned, ASP.NET 5 coming out was a really good time to do it, as we're already rebooting other parts of the stack as well. So concept compatible in the sense, same top-level experience, so you still get DB context, you still get DB set, but under the covers they're built over a much more lightweight and extensible core, which is similar to everything we've talked about today for ASP.NET 5.
Okay, but I know how to do DB context and DB set, and I know how to do code first.
Absolutely.
And I can take existing databases and make code first models, so it'll feel comfortable.
Yes, absolutely. We want you to start and very much feel like you're working with Entity Framework.
Okay, cool.
We're not pulling everything forwards. EF has brought a lot of baggage with it. There's a lot of stuff you could do, but almost nobody ever did. Some examples were just very complex mapping scenarios that were possible. You could mix table per hierarchy and table per type and table per concrete type, inheritance mapping, all into the one inheritance hierarchy. And this was just stuff people very rarely did, and it made the whole code base very complicated. As we'll see an example in code in a minute. We also had the ability to a feature called MEST, or multiple entity sets per type, which is supported in the core of EF and relates to reusing the same CLR type to map to different instances of a table. Hasn't been supported ever in the DB context API, and so you had to drop down to object context, and we've just found nobody ever complained about the fact it was missing from DB context because nobody uses it.
And what was it called?
Called MEST, multiple entity sets, but exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good reason to get rid of it.
Yeah. I should also note, obviously we're shedding a bit of baggage. That gives us a bit of room to pull in some new features people have been asking for. So stuff like batching updates. When you call save changes, we don't do one round trip to the database for every row that you're inserting or adding now. And we'll look at a few other ones as well when we're going into demos. Now the one somewhat controversial point we have is that in EF7 we've made the call to just bring forward code-based modeling. Now when we first started talking about this, we called this we're only bringing code first forwards, which of course everyone thinks, well, I write my classes and I generate my database and freak out because I work in an enterprise where I have existing databases.
Exactly.
Code-based modeling is about having your model expressed in code rather than XML. You can create your model and have a database generated for you and then update it with migrations, or you can start with an existing database and have it generated into a model which you can then tweak to match how you want your domain classes to.
What does this mean for people who have, quote unquote, invested in large designer-made models? Where does the intellectual property lie?
So that's actually a really good question. There's two data points I would put on here. One is that right now, EF7, we're not selling it as a replacement for EF6. EF7, it's kind of part V1. We're going to keep investing in EF6 for a while. And I know Microsoft says that a lot, but you can go and see that that's reality now. We've been working on EF7 for about a year, and you can see we've done incremental updates. We've done EF 6.1, 6.1.1, 6.1.2. That was all done at the same time we were working on the EF7 code base. So we're actually adding features, fixing things, taking community contributions. So you can stay on EF6 and still be supported for a while. Obviously, it's not going to be forever, but...
Well, it's like web forms. People keep asking about what web forms means in the context of ASP.NET 5. we're still putting cool stuff into web forms. We just added async and async model binding.
Exactly.
We've added new stuff to web forms going forward. So, it's a fork.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And, it's going to take a bit of time for EF7 to have all of the rich capabilities that 6 had. Some of them are going to look a bit different. So for some people upgrading, we wouldn't recommend that you go and take an existing big EF6 app and try and upgrade it to EF7. Definitely not now. Probably not in 6 months, maybe in 12 months. Be the time to start thinking about that. All right. So here was an example. Folks can say, well, you were doing a lot of good stuff in EF6. It was a bit slow. Could you improve the performance? But does it really justify a rewrite? So I wanted to look, obviously at the heart of an ORM is saying, well, I've got this CLR class. I want to go and find out what table it maps to. So you would think the core of an object relational mapper would be optimized for finding out what table a class maps to. So here's the code from EF6. As you can see, it's not exactly intuitive. A whole bunch of stuff going on there. Aside from this being horrible to work out how to write, it's also very slow because our stack has to do this over and over again. If we contrast that with EF7, it's very simple. We're basically saying, pull up the metadata you have for the entity type. I want to get the relational parts of the metadata you have and just show me the table it maps to. Now, to be fair, a CLR class can map to multiple different tables. We could have some properties in one table, some in another.
But when I see this is a before and after?
Yes.
Like when I see a before and after like this, what are you supposed to, I'm not sure what I'm emotionally supposed to do with this slide.
You're supposed to say,
on the left, I'm like, well, what were you thinking?
Yeah.
But on the right, I'm thinking, is it really that easy? Like, that can't be right.
So if you operate in a domain where you know that your class is mapped to one table, which is 99, probably 90-something% of applications out there, then the code is really this simple. This is literally taken from an application I wrote.
But oftentimes I'll have like a view model where I'm trying to get a model out of the database where a couple of tables are going to come out and I want to join them together into either a view model or what's close to a view model, a data transfer object that's well on its way to becoming a view model.
Yeah, so the way this API works here, but things are basically stored as annotations within the metadata. So we have a core which doesn't really know anything about tables or columns because those don't apply on all data stores. And this is some sugar APIs, extension methods basically, over the top of that metadata saying, give me the relational metadata and then give me the table from that. Now, obviously, if I was mapping to multiple tables, then the API gets a little bit more complicated. There'd probably be a Boolean flag. I can test whether it maps to multiple tables or not. But,
I see.
This code on the left is actually from one of the most popular, I just copied it from one of the most popular posts I've done on my blog. Because people want to know how to do this stuff, and obviously it's extremely unintuitive.
Yeah. With all due respect.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you don't have to respect me because nobody on our
I don't know how. I mean, the third line kind of makes sense, but the rest of it, I don't think I could do.
Yeah, I think I get lost halfway through the first line. So.
Well, you wrote it.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. No. All right. So that's enough talking about it.
Let's see some code.
Some stuff. So, like I said, this first demo, I'm going to look at what does normal data access look like with EF7.
Sure.
And kind of subtitled this the Don't Freak Out demo because stuff looks pretty similar. So here I have a simple ASP.NET 5 application. It's an MVC app. It's basically empty. I've got a bunch of boilerplate code to have MVC working, and I've started padding out a model. In here, as part of the default project templates, I have Entity Framework installed.
Okay.
So you'll see here I have Entity Framework.SQL Server NuGet package. This is one important thing to point out. Historically, if you installed the Entity Framework package, that was kind of Entity Framework plus everything to make SQL Server work because we're Microsoft and we ship SQL Server. Things are a bit better factored now, so the core is completely data store agnostic. You would typically install a package for the provider you want to use. So you'd install Entity Framework.SQL Server, .SQLite, .Azure Table Storage.
I see, and then so you have Entity Framework, the core, and then the plugin.
Exactly, yeah. And then here's another plugin too. So obviously when you installed the Entity Framework package, you also got the migrations commands. Now you get those by installing Entity Framework.commands.
Oh, so those are separate. So migrations are optional.
Yeah, and I don't have to deploy them, right? I might just use them locally, but I don't need to deploy the package with my PowerShell commands in it.
How would you express that, given what we've learned about ASP.NET 5?
So this would be a dev time dependency, or whatever we're calling that feature now.
Ah, okay.
I don't necessarily have to go and deploy all this stuff to my production server.
You would exclude it from being published.
Exactly,
Okay.
and like we said, this is kind of a little bit under the covers. If you just create a new ASP.NET 5 from the project template, then you get all this stuff pre-installed and you're ready to go. All right, so I've kind of written some boilerplate code to get us started. I have a simple POCO class here called Bike. This is a cycle sales company. They sell bicycles. They keep a database with some inventory and product catalog, etc. I've started a cycle sales context here. You'll notice this looks very much like EF6. We inherit from DB context. This class represents our session with the database.
Yep.
We expose a DB set for each type in our model, allows us to query and save instances of the types. First thing I'm going to look at is something that is a little bit different. We made it easier to do code-based configuration. So in EF6, you would have this separate DB configuration object, and there was some stuff you could set, some stuff you couldn't set, and there was one of them globally for all your contexts. We now have an onConfiguring method that you can override. This is somewhat akin to the onModel creating method we have. When you want to configure the model, this helps you configure the context.
Does onModel creating still exist?
Yes, it does. We'll actually see that a little bit later. So I get this options thing come in, and what I get on here is really some extension methods. So I've got use SQL Server as one of those extension methods. And that's available because I have the SQL Server package installed. If I only had SQLite installed, I would just say use SQLite instead.
Is this similar to the kind of the similar model to the way ASP.NET says use this or use that?
Yeah, this is similar to kind of code you'd write in startup.cs where different things light up when you have packages referenced.
Okay.
So we're going to say use SQL Server. Now, obviously, in my context code isn't necessarily the best place to put my connection string, so we're going to look at where we can move this to later. But for the moment, I'm just going to pull in a SQL connection string from a code snippet. I'm cheating. So we're targeting SQL Express. I'm targeting a database on there called Cycle Sales. And I've just switched on integrated authentication for that. So this is essentially all I need to do to get my model up and running. Now, one thing we have changed in EF7 is that we don't do any magic database creation. You might remember from EF6, you could like write a model and press F5, and it would magically create a database for you somewhere.
Which worked most of the time, but then if you deleted the database, sometimes you got yourself into weird situations.
Yeah. And if you were a first-time user coming to it and you pressed F5, you're like, well, that's great, it worked, but where the heck's my database?
Yep.
All those kind of things. So we're trying to make things much more explicit. We also found with that, we kind of lead people off down a path that looked all pretty and nice, and then they would want to change their model, and it's like, oh, well, sorry, you actually wanted the path back down there. So you've got to go unlearn some of the stuff you learned and then head back off down a different path.
Okay.
So all that to set up that essentially migrations are part of the default experience now. So I want to create a database based on my model. So I'm going to load up Package Manager console. Now, everything I'm doing here is just from a command line. I just like having my command line in my IDE, so I happen to be using Package Manager console here. But
before, people were typing things like enable migration and add migration, and it had to happen in Package Manager console.
Yep. So outside of ASP.NET 5, we still have all those commands available in Package Manager console. And that's just because currently in ASP.NET 5, there's no integration between the project system and Package Manager console. But if you're writing a phone app or a store app or WinForms, whatever, you have the same add migration and update database commands you had before.
Okay.
But underneath that, we actually also have a command line, which will work as well. So you can get the extra sugar of Package Manager console if you want. You don't have to. You can just use a command line as well.
And is it is it me typing KEF?
Yeah, so let's look at that. So because I'm just using this as a command line, it's not really getting any context about my projects or whatever. So I'm going to cd into the actual folder that my project is in on disk. Okay. And then we'll do KEF. And we'll see, it's going to print out the list of Entity Framework commands along with a beautiful little ASCII unicorn.
I haven't seen the ASCII unicorn.
Yeah, it's nice, hey? And remember from the previous sessions, I can't remember who it was, but someone showed this. If we go look in Project JSON, I'm getting EF here because it's listed under the commands section in my Project JSON.
Ah.
And it's basically forwarding on to the entity framework.commands package that I have installed.
And we can make that could be DB or whatever.
Yeah, you can rename it if you want.
Yep. Got it.
Now we've also tweaked things a little bit for the K version of these. They're a little bit more K-ish to kind of align with the rest of the commands. So I do KEF, I want to work with migrations. So I type migration. Mm-hmm. Type add because I want to add a new migration. Okay. And I get to give this thing a name. So I'm just going to call it initial schema. But I could type anything in here.
Will there be tooling to do this?
Not yet.
Have you thought about if there should be?
We have. Actually, when we initially did migrations, we kind of started with the command line experience and assumed we were going to do tooling. And then everyone seemed to be really happy with the command line experience, so we never got round to doing the tooling. We hear every now and then from somebody who wants it, but for the most part, people seem to be really happy with the command line experience. That said, I think we might still end up doing it. It would be nice to have a little window in VS that says, oh, I noticed you've got a pending migration.
Sure.
Click this button to
let's see what it looks like.
So we'll go ahead and scaffold out. And I use the word scaffold intentionally. This code is designed to be scaffolded code that you would own and edit. We don't always get migrations right. It's kind of EF taking a guess at what you want to do. So you'll notice the migrations folder just popped up.
This is very similar to the way it was before.
Exactly, yeah. You'll notice in ASP.NET we don't nest designer files just yet, so I'm seeing them both show up, but one would traditionally be nested underneath the other one. And I see exactly what I'm used to from past versions of EF is a nice little API that says go create this table with these columns. This isn't tied to my model, so I could add in extra columns.
But you have not made the database yet.
Not yet, so I could edit this if I wanted to.
Okay.
I don't want to. It looks pretty good to me. To actually make the database, I use KEF migration apply, which will take any pending migrations, in this case just one, and apply them to the database. Now, I should point out in this workflow, I'm kind of doing the create my model, generate a database for me. EF7 totally supports the other model as well. I have a database, create my model for me.
If you typed KEF migration and hit enter, would it give you the subcommands?
I actually don't know if it will yet.
It should.
I'm not sure if it will, for sure. I'm not sure what it does.
Because it reminds me of, add, apply, list, script. Okay, so it's like Azure, VM list, and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's comfortable.
With an ASCII art unicorn.
I have to say I'm impressed, and thank you for carrying
Shout out
that.
to Bryce Lamson who built that for us.
Carrying that forward, Bryce.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a database here now. Everything we're used to, there's a migration history table. This records which migrations are applied to the database, and obviously we have a bike table that matches our CLI class. Okay, now obviously ASP.NET 5 is all about dependency injection, and everything should be registered in my dependency injection container. So let's go to startup.cs. In here we'll see in the default project template there's a bit of code already scaffolded out to kind of wire up everything entity framework. So we have some sugar methods on here which allow me to add a DB context. So I'm going to add in an instance of cycle sales context. This is basically registering my context in DI so that any of my components, like controllers or anything else, depend on this. They can have it injected as a dependency.
Okay, so, and I don't do that via an interface. I would just simply have like a property called cycle sales context.
Well, this is a class. Oh, yeah, typically a constructor parameter. Which
okay, so I can do a constructor parameter, or I can do a property and say activate.
Exactly, yeah. Absolutely. And this is effectively just sugar. We'll get to config in a little bit, and there's some extra stuff you can do with this method, but it's essentially registering a scoped instance of this. So within the request, there'll be one instance of the cycle sales context shared across all the components just for the scope of the request.
Okay. So every request gets their own context.
Yeah, which is the pattern we highly recommend you do with Entity Framework.
And this is nice because this is by default.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. In fact, if you create the default project template with ASP.NET Identity, then you'll get a line like this for the ASP.NET Identity context.
Nice.
This means you don't have to worry about managing the lifetime of your context. Just ask for it in the constructor and you'll get it. All right, so we have an EF model. It's registered, but we don't really have any way to test it yet. So let's drop back out to our command line. And I'm just going to use scaffolding. So kgen controller. So I'm going to scaffold out a controller. I want bike to be the model class. And my DB context is cycle sales context. So this would be the same as right-clicking on the controllers folder and saying add controller. But a nice command line way of doing it. Okay, so we've done that. Let's go open up the code it's scaffolded. So we'll see bike controllers now here.
Very similar as before.
Yep, absolutely. So a few things to tidy up here. At the moment I'm creating an instance of the context within the controller, but that's not very DI friendly, so let's get rid of that and we'll do exactly what we talked about. We'll create a constructor. We'll take in an instance of the context, which DI will give to us. And we'll just register that, and that'll be the instance of the context we use here.
Okay.
And then one other update I want to show you, just something that's a bit nicer now. If I scroll down, I'll see this line of code here. This was, EF didn't really support an attach as modified pattern in the past. So you'd have to do this weird thing where you go through the change tracker, you look up the entry for the bike, and you set its state to modified. This is pretty ugly, so let's...
Why is that squiggled?
Because our scaffolding's not up to date with our runtime, so
oh,
it should be this. which was...
Do that again?
So just take out the change tracker.
I see.
We originally had entry hanging off the change tracker, but that's not where it was in EF6. So this seemed like one of those API ones. We'd probably move it to change tracker now, but that's where it has been in the past, so let's just leave it there.
Okay. So you basically say we modified this entry.
Yep, but let's delete all that code and do something better. So we'll go bikes. Just call update. And that looks way better, right? Go and update this bike.
And how does it figure out from that instance?
By default, it just attaches this thing as modified. So it's going to do an update for all the properties. And this is the easiest pattern to do in MVC.
And it knows because of the bike's ID.
No, I'm telling it it's existing. So if it had an ID of 0, then if I wanted to do that where I look at the ID and work it out, then I would call add if it had an ID of 0, or update, which is attached as modified, if it didn't. But remember here we're in a method called edit, so it's editing an existing bike. So I'm happy just to assume.
Forgive my ignorance, but
go for it.
That's very clean, and that's like the simplest. Like that's very easy to teach. But when you say bikes.update and you pass in a bike, it knows that is the bike, a specific bike, because of its primary key.
Yes. So it's going to issue an update statement for that. Now, so I would say this bike has an ID of 4, say, so it's going to do an update bike set blah equals blah, where ID equals 4.
All right, cool.
Now, there's obviously better patterns you could do here. You could query and change so we'd only update the columns that are actually updated. We could do something like e-tags.
Yeah, it could be more sophisticated.
Yeah, but
it's going to do a complete all fields update.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, good for basic CRUD, and certainly good for learning.
Yeah, absolutely, and good for scaffolded templates. It's pretty easy, and I can add in extra logic if I want. So now that we've got this written, let's just run and make sure it actually works.
Yeah, before, like everyone does examples of get, but getting edit and new, clean and simple and right is so important.
So while we're on that topic, before we go look at it, this API is not in this build. I think it just got checked in yesterday, but we are going to have an API.
I like that you just changed direction completely.
Yeah.
That's good.
We'll see it working.
No, I like it. Please do.
So we're going to have something like this, attached graph. So update, add, etc. work really well when I have one object, but they don't work super great when I have one root of an object that has a whole other.
Then you're all in trouble.
I'm attaching an order. It has order lines and products and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Or if you have some kind of enum that's a lookup table and
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So attached graph is kind of exactly what we just talked about. So I give it a root, and it's going to go and look at everything that it can reach from that object based on the metadata it has. And it's going to go through, and this overload is going to see if it has a primary key set. So if they're integer primary keys, if the ID is anything other than 0, it will attach it. And if the ID is 0, it will mark it as added. So it's like a very simplistic way.
And it's going to do this without calling a bunch of SQL commands?
Yes, exactly. It'll just kind of...
It's all in memory.
This is kind of what a lot of people wrote the hard way by default. And then the other option I have, if my logic's a bit more complicated than that, I can register a fancy little lambda here and say, and this gives me the state entry for the thing that it's about to attach. So I could set the state, I can tell it which properties are modified, I can tell it to skip this object, like don't attach this at all. So this is good if I want to get a bit more advanced.
Interestingly, why is it saying that that's not available on ASP.NET 5?
Oh, it's not available anywhere at the moment. That's interesting. It says it's available for core. It's not, because it doesn't even exist in this build.
Because you just made it up.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, cool.
All right. So when people ask about detached entity scenarios, that's kind of typically what they're asking about. Like, I have a graph, I want to attach it. It was very hard in 6. We now have the building blocks to make it easier in 7.
Nice.
And we have more stuff planned after that. That's just how far we've got so far.
All right. You were still saying something about, at the very beginning, not creating a database by default and how that was freaking people out.
Yes.
You showed it to migrations. Everything you showed so far looks very similar to what we have today.
Yeah, so all we've really done, you could do migrations from the start if you wanted to, or you could, that very first time you ran, you would get that special, like we special cased F5 for the first time and we'll bootstrap a bunch of stuff. And then unfortunately later that means when we enable migrations, there's a whole bunch of flaky, scary code that runs to work out that probably want to make it look like you use migrations to create it. So we basically just tore that bit of the product out because it's confusing and it's full of bugs. It's very hard to get stable and working. So the default experience obviously now is to use migrations to create your database.
Got it.
It also nicely differentiates the I'm targeting an existing database or I'm creating my database from the model. The creating the database from the model is now explicit. So if you're expecting to write a model and target an existing database, if you accidentally pointed it to the wrong database name or something, EF would be like, oh, that doesn't exist, let me create it for you.
Yeah, and it would be chaos.
Super confusing. So.
Yeah.
All right, so we had our simple form scaffolded out. Obviously, this is very early build of scaffolding. It doesn't. So we'll create, I don't know, bike BB100. That could be big bike, and then we'll create a small bike as well. This one can be a bit cheaper, $99. All right, so everything's working. We have basic data access up and running. And like we said, there's a few differences, but for the most part, it looks and feels very much like EF6.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to pop back to slides for a second, just to flash up our new topic, which is going to dig into some stuff that's actually new in EF7.
There we go.
So now I've hopefully allayed most of everybody's fears. Let's look at some cool new stuff we were able to do.
Let's freak you out now that we've made you feel comfortable.
Well, hopefully what I'm going to demo will actually just make people happy. So,
all right.
Obviously, migrations is a bit of a learning curve there. So if I come to EF and I just write a context, then I might not know that migrations is the thing I want. So one of the cool things we did, and this is exclusively for ASP.NET 5, is we introduced some help pages that when I'm developing locally will actually help me learn about migrations. So, and obviously these are optional things. You don't have to use them, but they just kind of ease the learning curve a bit. So I've introduced a model change. This obviously requires a change in the database as well. I don't have a features column in my table yet. But before we create a migration, let's swap back to IE, and I'll just refresh here. Now, this is going to result in an exception in the database because there is no features column. But you notice I'm getting an error page with a bit more context on it that says, hey, this is a DB context. You have migrations enabled, and there's some pending changes you haven't scaffolded to a migration yet.
So how did you do this? This is a piece of middleware?
This is a piece of middleware, and it also uses logging. So logging's great for writing out text information to a thing, but we also have structured logging now, so we can actually pass state into the logging. So whenever a database exception occurs within EF, it actually writes out structured logging to say, this is the exception, this is the context it occurred on, this is the exception type we got. And so this piece of middleware listens to that and says, oh, well, that context has migrations enabled. I think I can give you a bit more context to help you solve this problem.
And this doesn't go into production, why? Like,
it could if you really wanted it to.
I don't.
No, obviously. So
how do I keep that out of production?
Along with the standard error page, which gives you a whole bunch of context on errors, we go to startup.cs. You'll see they're wrapped in this if block that says, if I'm in development, then go ahead, enable browser link, the standard error page, which gives me stack traces and things like that, and also the database error page, which helps me out with migrations.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Now, I should add, these two things are separate pieces of middleware at the moment. We are looking at integrating the database error page as kind of a plug-in for the error page, but it works.
That's still pretty cool.
Yeah. So let's do what it said. Let's bring back up Package Manager Console.
And again, just to be clear, I want to understand, you're doing this, the Package Manager Console, because you like doing it from here.
Yeah, I could just...
You don't have to do this from here.
No, I can do it from standard command.
People should remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. It would be interesting, I'm thinking, if you could right-click on that inside of bike.cs, make the gesture in the CS file rather than over in the, like the initial obvious thing to do is to stick it on a right click somewhere in Solution Explorer. But it seems more like a control dot or a smart tag.
Yeah, or we have this new light bulbs feature, right, where things kind of context stuff can pop up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, so we added a migration. Now we would...
Even better, I'm sorry, I just had a total brainwave. We can plug in browser link stuff. You could have your error inside of IE there, have the light bulb light up in the browser, and then push the stuff back with browser link.
Hold that thought for a second. So
don't tell me you already did it.
No, not quite. Well,
okay.
This might be.
That was going to I would fall out right here.
So I added a migration. It's sitting here in my project. I should apply it now because this thing's here ready for me to tweak.
Sure.
But let's forget to apply it, even though it told me to here.
Yeah.
Let's just refresh this page. And so it's going to tell me, you got the same exception, but this time it's smarter.
No!
It knows it's here, so I can just say, well,
no!
go and apply it.
How did you do that?
And then I refresh the page. Middleware. Got to be careful because we really don't want to deploy this to production.
No, but that was cool.
Yeah. So
I totally just made that up.
Yeah. So we could do the same thing with add to. We just haven't yet because we have this whole just edit the file system.
But still, that was cool.
Yeah. And now I can just press F5 from the browser and everything's, yeah, it all works.
No, I totally just that's awesome. Okay, that was cool. All right, you win.
All right, that's the database error page.
Yes, good night, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
That was cool.
So for quick coding.
No, that was impressive. Yeah, what else can you do for me?
Yeah. All right, batching. Let's take a quick look at that. So we have price service here. This is just a simple little service class I wrote. It takes an instance of our context. Nothing particularly interesting there. Has this method. Basically update the prices. I might say I want to double all my prices, so I pass in a multiplier of 2. It loads all of the data from the database, sets the retail price to 2 times whatever it was, and then calls save.
And it just knows that you changed them all. Change tracking.
Yes. Yep. So this is typical EF6 behavior.
I know. It's always impressive, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, obviously, this only works because I'm doing it on an instance of the context. If I detach this thing and send it to the browser and then it comes back later,
right.
I have to do more work.
And I'm still, when I see stuff like this, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, I would still be afraid of whatever SQL this generates.
Yeah. Let me just code that up quickly. Right. No. So I will say what this doesn't generate, which would be awesome if we could do this in the future. It would be great to write some kind of link statement that says, instead of like pulling the data back into memory, updating it, and then saving it, let's just write a link thing that says update bikes where set.
Exactly.
And it could push it
that
in
would
a
be
single
really
statement.
Cool.
That would be cool. We don't do that yet. All right. Let's just expose an action on our controller so that we can actually call this service. So I'm just going to use a code snippet. So I'm introducing an action that just says, go and double all the prices. Why not? All right, let's just F5 on this one. We'll do the whole recompile in the background thing.
Okay. And when did the prices get doubled?
Okay, so I'm going to call the action now. So double prices. Now, when my action is completed, it does a redirect back to this page.
Sure.
So if we look in on here, we can see everything just doubled. It used to be $1.99, it's now $3.98.
Yeah, sure.
$3.99, it's now $1.98. All right, so the interesting thing, I've got SQL Server Profiler running here. Historically, if I had 2 bikes in the database, that would have been 2 round trips to the database to update for each one. If I had 100, it would have been 100 round trips.
Right.
Now we batch everything up into a single command. So,
and how did you know to do that?
We basically run some heuristics to work out what we can batch together, if that makes sense. Obviously, in this case, it's pretty simple. We're doing update statements. It's pretty safe to send all this stuff in one batch. It gets much more complicated when we have relationships and orders matter.
Sure.
And maybe we've got an identity column and we need to pull back the results.
And you could do this for millions of rows?
Well, there's actually some limits on SQL Server.
You've run out of @p number.
Well, we probably won't run out of those, but there are limits to how many, how big this command can be. So we're intelligent in our SQL Server provider. We know what the limits of SQL Server are, and we try to be intelligent about what we do.
Cool.
All right, so we've got 2 update statements going on here together, which is great. You also mentioned what does the SQL look like. So an EF6 never generated a query like this. This is kind of something I might actually write by hand. It's obviously very simple.
Other than the square brackets, it's quite tidy.
Yeah, I guess you probably wouldn't alias. We could look at removing that too.
No, it's just, the question is when you have something generating something, does it need to generate idiomatic something, or does it need to generate as close to idiomatic as would be performant?
Exactly, yeah. It's actually interesting. In EF6, we did some updates to the SQL generation that were purely cosmetic. They had no benefit for improvement.
Really, just to make people feel better.
Yeah, on the simple stuff, you don't want to see select star from, select star from. Now, SQL Server is smart enough to know that that's the same thing, but people freak out when they see it. So. All right. Testing was always difficult with EF. We made it easier in EF 6.1, I think. We kind of opened up DBSet. It was no longer sealed. You could just mock DBSet directly, but...
Yeah, every time someone sees something sealed or internal, they get upset, as rightfully so.
Interestingly, everything in our code base is public at the moment. We're working out ways to differentiate, so we think we're going to use namespaces to differentiate. Like, everything's public, but this is something you probably don't want to mess around with unless you really know what
internal as a namespace.
Something like that,
Don't touch.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're going to try and test the bike service. Now, at the moment, cycle sales context, we kind of hard-coded a whole bunch of stuff in that class to say this connects to this SQL Server instance, this database name, etc. So we're going to look at changing that. So we'll go to the context. Just close down a couple of these things. All right, so we want to get rid of this code here and move it somewhere else.
Right.
So I'm going to introduce a constructor. And this thing is going to bring in DB context options. which is basically the settings. And you'll look down here when you see on configuring, this is the thing we're configuring down here.
Right.
But instead, we're going to pass it in from external. And I can also kind of strongly type these to say that these are the options for this particular type of context.
If that context had options that were specific to itself?
Exactly, yeah. This is handy with DI because I don't want to register like 6 different DB context options if I have 6 different context types. I want to register them explicitly for this context.
I think that you want to get rid of that.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Let's just format things a bit too. All right, so now we're going to get rid of this code. I'm just going to copy a little bit of it into the clipboard, and then we'll just delete the rest of it, like so. And then I'm going to go to startup.cs because this is where I configure how it's going to work for my MVC application when it's running.
Right.
So let's go up to this bit here. And this, I mentioned this method here can do some extra stuff. So I can basically paste the same code here and say, for this context, when you create an instance of it, pass in these settings.
Okay, and then that could presumably come from an INI file or a JSON file or
exactly
anywhere else in this in the configuration subsystem.
Yeah. So at the moment in EF7, there's the ability to get rid of the connection string from here and pull that from the config file. If we just look at config.json. So you can see here this, I just left this here as an example. My app's not actually using it at the moment, but it's saying this is the connection string for this context for entity framework.
And don't you say like get value entity framework dot cycle sales context dot connection string?
You can do that, or by convention EF will match these particular ones.
So it'll just pick it up automatically?
Yeah, the way it actually works, if you call the parameterless overload of this, then useSQL server is actually the thing that says, well, you're using me, you haven't specified anything, so let me look in config and see you.
And do you get a really cool error message with a blue button that says fix it?
No, you don't.
No? Okay. I'm just saying. Now that you've opened the door, I expect no less.
All right, so we're set up for MVC. Let's go look at a unit test quickly. So obviously for a unit test, I want to be hitting my actual database with my local data that I've been messing around with.
Right.
So we're going to kind of look at this in 2 steps. First up, I'm just going to uncomment this test.
And whose unit testing framework are you using here?
I am using XUnit.
XUnit, okay. Because they've updated for .NET, ASP.NET.
Yeah, actually, if you look in here, I have xunit.krunner. So this is allowing me to...
Oh, let me see your project JSON, because we were talking about testing earlier.
Sorry, let me close that.
Yeah, look at that.
Yep.
Commands test.
Yep, so I obviously have this pulls in XUnit, which gives me all the XUnit stuff too. And from the command, I'm going to use VS, but from the command, I could run ktest from here.
Absolutely lovely.
Okay, so at the moment, this thing, I've just set it up. It still uses SQL Server, it connects to SQL Express, but it's going to use a different database instance called test database.
Although I did notice in your project.json, you had entity framework in memory also.
Now we're going to look at that in a second. You're spoiling it.
Sorry.
It's a teaser. So the way the test works, it creates an instance of the context. It basically resets the database, deletes it, and recreates it. This is basically designed for unit testing, where I don't want to mess around with migrations and stuff. Like, just create the database that matches my model for me. Add some stuff, save it. Then I have my actual test where I update the prices.
Right.
And then I query back for the data in a fresh context to make sure that stuff actually happened. Arguably not the best way to write this test, but it works. All right. So for our test explorer, I'll just run this test so everyone believes.
And this is interesting, and if I understand correctly, because the project JSON has a command called test, that's how this got plugged in here, right?
I'm actually not sure if it's that or it's components in the xunit.krunner thing.
Some kind of magic, though.
Yeah, stuff happens.
I just think it's really nice, though, that you're in the Visual Studio Test Explorer.
Exactly.
The XUnit people don't have to write yet another GUI for their tests. Everybody wins.
Yep. Okay, and if we go quickly look at our SQL Express instance and refresh here, you see there's a test database, and that was great. I could hook my test up to a different instance. Now, like you said, hitting an actual database is not necessarily ideal for our unit tests. So let's flick over. We'll delete the use SQL Server and replace it with a use in-memory store. And this is available because, like you said in my project JSON, I have the entity framework.inmemory package installed. Now, because I've created an instance of my options, and I pass that same instance of the options to the 3 different instances of the context I use, so here, here, and then again at the bottom, it's going to use the same in-memory store for all 3 of those contexts, if that makes sense. So they're accessing the same instance of the in-memory store, But I could write another unit test and say use in-memory, and it'll actually use a different instance of the in-memory store. So my tests are isolated.
Show me where it got set up again.
So I'm setting it up here.
In this one fact.
Yes. Now, obviously, I might want to share my in-memory store between tests.
I see.
If I wanted to.
Better to do it.
I want it scoped to my tests.
No, that's a valid point.
Yeah. But the nice thing here is I don't have to muck around with mocking anything. I also don't have to worry about how I hook things up. It's just kind of there. Now, obviously, if you had a complicated model, you might have to do a bit of config to say when targeting in memory, you might have to do some extra stuff to set it up. Obviously, like identity is not going to work.
Sure.
Do it this way, but all right. So let's just run our test again.
So there you're really testing your model.
Yeah, I'm testing. Hopefully what I'm trying to test is both my model and the logic within my service that's using my model. Now, obviously, an in-memory store is never going to behave exactly the same as a relational database. In fact, no two relational databases behave exactly the same, so you still need to do functional testing. But this is kind of a cheap, easy way to write unit tests. Some people will argue, too, that using EF in the unit test is probably a bit too heavy as well, and that's fine. You don't have to, but this is easy.
Right, but if you have a bunch of logic in a controller around EF, and it pulls a bunch of things out of EF, thinks about it, puts stuff back in, brings it back out, then EF is part of the test.
Yep.
And in-memory way is a nice way to mock it out without mocking it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, are you going to mock out all the EF stuff?
Yeah,
or are you just trying
difficult.
Which is difficult, or just have an in-memory database?
Exactly, yeah.
Cool.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. Yeah, I'm going to quickly show you this one. So,
well, and also I want to hear how people can keep up on this, because are they going to get dailies, or where are they going to be watching? Because this is coming in, fast, and there's docs are being written as the code's being written.
Absolutely, yeah. So actually, I'm just going to mention the last demo. I won't actually go into it. What I was going to show, we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about that. I was going to show that you can now introduce properties effectively into your model without actually having them in your CLR class. So this is helpful if I want to introduce, say, a last updated property, which is part of my auditing information. And I want to be able to kind of reference that when I'm working with my context. So I might want to set it and save changes. But I don't want to actually expose it in my CLR class because it's not really part of my domain model. We've introduced the concept of shadow state so that I can add properties to my model, but that extra metadata is kind of stored in the change tracker, and it's not actually polluting, if you will, my CLR class.
What's an example of an obvious use for shadow?
So the demo I'm doing, the demo takes a few minutes, so we won't dig into it, but auditing information was the example I used. So I only care about setting the last updated and who updated stuff during save changes within the context. So that doesn't need to go and pollute my domain model, because I never show it in the UI. I never want to change it outside of the context of actually saving the changes.
You don't want to carry it around in every single model.
Exactly, yeah.
I see.
Yeah. But the nice thing is, by coding it as shadow state, I can still reason about it in a kind of strongly typed-ish way without having to drop down below EF and manipulate SQL commands before they hit the database.
Is that up on your blog as an example?
Yeah, so actually let's swap back to PowerPoint. And I've got some links here. So the bottom link here is the demo code that I just showed. So there's an example of it there. Yeah, if you went to my GitHub account too, for all the demos I've done recently, there's source code for all of those up there too. So you'd see examples of that and various other features as well. In terms of keeping up with this, if you just want to know more about EF7 and what EF7 is all about, the aka.ms/aboutEF7 is the place to go. That'll take you to a page on our GitHub site that has kind of EF7 in 100 words or less, and then links to relevant blog posts about some hot topics like what does it mean to only support code-based modeling. So we kind of dig into that in some detail. What does it mean to be part v7 and part v1? And we dig into that in some detail. All the ones where if you want to get passionate, go and read the blog comments on those. And then if you want to just follow along with what our team is doing, our GitHub repository is ASP.NET/Entity Framework. People are sometimes concerned about that or confused about the ASP.NET thing. And EF is not specific to ASP.NET, but we work very closely with ASP.NET because we just have the same development style. We like to be fairly lightweight. We like to be open source and very transparent and all those things. So our team just naturally fits with ASP.NET. So
and who's your boss?
Scott Hunter.
There you go.
Yeah, straight from the horse's mouth. So yeah. So that would be the right place to go to. I don't have the link on the screen too, but if you want to kind of follow along with interesting stuff from our team, then our Twitter alias is EF Magic Unicorns.
As well it should be.
Exactly.
Very cool. All right. Well, this has been a lovely day here at the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Make sure, if you've only seen this One, you've missed a whole day of amazing content. Go back, watch it again, show your friends, show your mom. Everyone's going to love all of this stuff. My dad is watching, so I feel great. Thank you from everyone here, and make sure, answer the poll down here at the bottom of the screen. That's what the YouTube stars do.
All that
Make sure to answer the poll, and we will see you again very, very soon. Thank you.